After K-pop, K-movies, and K-dramas, K-literature is the latest form of K-culture gaining global attention. In the 5-year period from 2018 to 2022, 1.85 million copies of Korean literature were sold overseas. As the genres preferred by global readers diversify, Korean literature introduced abroad has been expanding to include graphic novels, essays, and more. Now, for today's Hallyu People, we connect live to Sydney, Australia, where Mark Oh, or Oh Ji-hwan, a young translator, introduces Korean fantasy literature to international readers. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Hello, I'm Mark Oh.
Thank you for joining us. Now, Mark, please introduce yourself to our viewers and what you currently do in Australia.
Hello, I'm Mark Oh, and I'm currently studying at the University of Sydney while working as a translator in Australia. So I mainly translate Korean fantasy literature, especially the Pangaea series, a fantasy novel written by my mother, Jun-ha.
And you just mentioned it, but you are translating into English the fantasy novel series Pangaea or Pangaea, depending on from where you are. There's a slight difference in the pronunciation, but which has been written, as you said, by a Korean author, and you just mentioned it, your own mother. So please tell us how this all started.
So actually, my mother has been writing novels in Korea for a long time, and I grew up reading her works. So Pangaea was a project she had been working on since I was elementary or in middle school. And even at that young age, I was deeply captivated by the story. So it's not just because it was my mother's work, but because Pangaea had an incredibly vast and immersive world. So I've always been drawn to expansive world building, whether in books, movies, or games. So as a child, I often imagined how Pangaea could be adapted into other IP, making it even more engaging. So perhaps these thoughts naturally lead me to want to share my mother's work with a broad audience. I felt that introducing this story to readers beyond Korea was a meaningful endeavor. So that's how I took my first step into translation, which has now brought me here.
Wow, it must feel very special to translate your own mother's work. How do you feel about it, and how does your mother, the actual author of the book, Ha Ji-eun, feel about this as well?
So translating my mother's work is both rewarding and actually exhausting. So it's not just about changing words from one language to another, but about preserving the emotions and messages she intended. So in this sense, our mother and son relationship works to my advantage, as I understand her style and intentions deeply. But it also means that our discussions can be more direct and at times exhausting. So anyway, I can tell that my mother is truly delighted that her work is being translated into English and reaching more readers.
It's very interesting how you mentioned exhausting, not just once but twice, but I guess that's how much effort you put into translating these works. Now, Mark, is there anything in particular you pay attention to when translating the Pangaea series? I mean, in terms of the uniqueness of fantasy fiction and also considering that your mother is the author.
So, yeah, actually, Pangaea is a fantasy novel that follows the journey of the 3 children as they search for their missing fathers and explore lost civilizations. So this series has a unique word and terminology, so I focused on making the translation immersive while staying true to the original tone. So my mother tends to use very descriptive language, and translating that naturally into English is always a challenge. So for example, some phrases that sound perfectly fine in Korean can feel vague in English. So in such cases, I try to find proper expressions in Western literature, movies, or games that English-speaking readers would find familiar. Yep.
And Mark, I mean, me as a reader of the Pangaea series, I especially found that it could be difficult to translate fantasy stories into English because with fantasy, in the stories, you have creatures and aliens, and you have an own imagination of those characters. So that's why I especially found that translating fantasy into a different language could be difficult because everyone has their own, imagination of these characters. characters.
Yeah.
So I believe that could also be one of the challenges when thinking about how to translate these expressions from Korean into English, especially when it's about fantasy.
Definitely. And I know you have a special bond with your mother, the author of the book, but is there any other special experiences that you've experienced, that helped you translate this Pangaea series?
So actually, I've always loved fantasy novels and become familiar with fantasy terminology and world building through online games. So the magic, combat, and quest-related vocabulary I encountered in games actually significantly helped me with translation. So beyond that, these experiences also influenced my mother's writing process. We often exchanged ideas and reviewed each other's work, which made the story more engaging. So for example, I would suggest, how about using this expression? Or wouldn't it be interesting if this concept was included? So this kind of back and forth refined the novel. So if you don't like online games, you probably wouldn't know at all. But recently, a game called Baldur's Gate was released by Larian Studios, which became a global hit. So although I could have played it in my native language, Korean, that could be more comfortable for me, but I chose to play it entirely in English, so I took notes on how characters spoke and the terminology used in the game, so which I later applied to my translations.
Wow, who knew that online games would help you in, translating a book, right? Very interesting.
Very interesting indeed. And also, Mark, we would be interested in how much exposure Korean literature is currently receiving in Australia.
I've actually lived in Sydney before, a few years ago, but I took a break from uni for a while. Back then, Korean literature was relatively rare in Australian bookstores. However, in recent years, it has become much more easier to find Korean books in major bookstores across the country. I think interest in K-pop has driven global curiosity about Korean culture, and the recognition of Hallyu as a Nobel Prize winner in literature has also contributed to a surge in interest in Korean literature. So I think more people in Australia are now actively seeking out Korean novels, and bookstores are responding by expanding their Korean literature sections.
Yes, probably Hangang's win in the Nobel Prize has put some influence into the bookstores in Australia as well. Now, also, just a quick, brief question, Mark. Did your friends actually read your novel, your translated novel, and what was their response?
Yes, I've shared my translated work with many friends, actually, because I was especially curious to see how young students in Australia would perceive my translation, whether it felt trendy or if any parts seemed awkward. So their feedback was positive. Many of them found the Pangaea series to be fresh and engaging. So some of them had never read a fantasy novel like this before, interestingly, and they were impressed by the unique world building and storytelling. Yeah.
Wow, you must be very happy to, get those positive reactions from your close friends as well. Now this Pangaea novel series is translated to English, so it's expanding globally. But I heard that it's being adapted into another kinds of, types of content that I heard.
Yes. A webtoon adaptation is currently being discussed, and in the long term, we are also considering the possibility of a musical or movie adaptation. But I'm sorry, but this is still a sensitive topic to discuss publicly, so I cannot share too many details at this time. Yeah.
All right, but really looking forward to see the Pangaea series, to see or listen to the contents later on. And we also want to ask you, before literature, Korean culture has been widely introduced in the form of K-pop and K-dramas and K-movies in Australia. Was there any moment you ever felt proud because of the Korean wave while living in Sydney?
Some memorable moment that stood out to me was when aespa, one of Korea's top idol groups, performed in Sydney, and so many students at my university were talking about the event. And I realized just how far-reaching Korean culture had become. Seeing the Korean world expanding beyond entertainment and into literature makes me, incredibly proud.
We can imagine. Now, last but not least, Mark, what are your future plans or aspirations as a translator or beyond?
So my first goal is to complete the English translation of my mother's series, Pangaea, from start to finish. In addition to that, I want to introduce more Korean fantasy literature that I enjoy or that I believe would resonate well with international audiences to global readers. So ultimately, I hope to establish a global agency that specializes not just in translating literature, but also in bringing Korean fantasy webtoons, novels, or games to an international audience. So I'm just want to bridge the gap between Korean creative works and a worldwide fan base.
Sounds fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for sharing your story with us today. Please keep up the great work in spreading fun Korean novels to readers around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you, Bella, for your contribution today. We will see you again tomorrow.
Yes, I'll see you back tomorrow.